appreciation as well to the Mackenzie Institute for putting on this conference today. You heard Dr. Pry talking about some of the actors who are capable and apparently willing to threaten Western countries such as ours, Western civilization, with literally annihilation with an EMP device. The sun also being able to do that and pose that kind of a threat. What I'd like to do is to pick up on that theme that Dr. Pry began and talk to you, offer you a little bit of an overview about some of those actors who are capable of threatening our critical infrastructure here in the United States, North America, Canada, and really the Western civilization more broadly. Because if we can go, as I would think of it, left of zero before an attack or even a plot takes form, our national security leadership will be able better to devise and to implement effective policy, knowing and understanding these actors in order to prevent them from ever getting to a plot stage or to the execution of such a plot as Dr. Pry described to you. So everything I'm going to tell you here this morning is unclassified. It comes from the open source world. I do have many business cards with me. If you would like one, please ask me, and if you would like to follow up on anything I say, ask where it comes from. We'll have a Q&A session. But also you can write to me and ask for the PowerPoint presentation. I'll send it to you. A little bit about what you just heard in terms of my background. Let me start here with this threat matrix that I've put together to show some of the actors that most acutely, critically threaten Western civilization. And the point about this matrix is that these actors work together on an ad hoc basis, an opportunistic basis to be sure, but in one way or the other, and from time to time, they do work together. And I think the time has passed when we can think about them discreetly or separately as threats that can be addressed in an individual way. They are interlinked, and that's the point really of this presentation and of this matrix. Look at the upper left-hand corner there, which is the nation-states corner of the slide, and you've got the flags there of Qatar, which funds an awful lot of jihadist terrorism around the world. The green flag is Saudi Arabia, which of course is another funder on a massive scale of subversive jihadist ideology. And then the flag at the bottom, Iran's. I could obviously put an awful lot of more flags up there if there had been room, and we'll talk about some other countries that belong in that group. You heard Dr. Pry mention some of those, to include, of course, Russia, China, and, of course, Iran. Go to the right-hand side at the top there, the sub-national and transnational jihad groups. These are what we would think of as the Islamic terrorist groups threatening us today. The black and white flag, of course, the Islamic State. The yellow one, Hezbollah. Come down sort of clockwise. The circular green emblem is the logo or the symbol of the Muslim Brotherhood, a jihadist organization. And of course, the last one there is the Organization of International, of Islamic Cooperation. How many of you have ever heard of the OIC? A few. Let me explain just very briefly then what that is. That is the 57-member state international group of all Muslim countries, 56 of those plus the Palestinian Authority, total 57 members. That is the largest group, international group in the world after the United Nations itself. It wields inordinate influence inside of the United Nations and implements policy in the name of, if you go to its website, in the name of the Islamic Ummah is the way they describe it on their website. Come down clockwise to the bottom right-hand corner. We're looking at transnational organized crime. These are your arms dealers, your document fraud, false documentation dealers, those who deal in narcotics, obviously. But that also, in the last square there, includes narco-trafficking cartels like the Zetas, which are a Mexican cartel, Sinaloa gang, Gulf cartel, and so forth. All of these you might think of as separate issues threatening security and clearly our infrastructure. But in fact, in many ways, and very often, they are working together. And that is what I want to cover for you today, to show you how the threat to our critical infrastructure is not limited to only nation states or even only terrorist organizations. So what I see happening is a shift between the last century and this one in the capabilities that can threaten our critical infrastructure. And previously, many of these capabilities were jealously, strongly guarded by nation states. But now, what we're seeing is that capabilities like advanced conventional weaponry, biological warfare, chemical warfare, cyber warfare included, and of course the missile delivery systems that you heard Dr. Pry talking about for the delivery of all kinds of payloads, including these, but also nuclear weapons or an EMP device. With the exclusion, I would say, of nuclear devices themselves, but these others now are in the hands of some of these actors that you saw in this threat matrix. Not just nation state. Jihad groups have some of these capabilities. Narco-trafficking and organized crime have some of these capabilities. Think just to what is going on in Mexico and the fight of the Mexican government and army against some of these narco-trafficking cartels, and the capabilities, because of the money, the unlimited funding that these cartels possess, their ability to acquire weaponry that actually is more powerful and in some cases more sophisticated than the weaponry of the government of Mexico and its army themselves. So that is what I mean about the migration of these capabilities from nation states into the hands of all kinds of nefarious actors in the aggregate who threaten our critical infrastructure in very many ways. The problem is not just that they have these capabilities, but they work together and they share an animosity and a hatred of Western civilization, in addition to the usual profit-making motivation that you might normally ascribe to criminals or narco-traffickers. So even though the capabilities, the ideologies, intent, objectives of these different organizations we saw in the matrix vary quite widely, what they do share is a willingness to take down Western civilization, to go against Western civilization. When I talk about Western civilization, I'm talking about the system that came into being after about the 1600s, when you might recall from history that there were horrific wars throughout Europe among principalities and kingdoms and huge loss of life. And at the end of it, they came together, these kingdoms and principalities, and said, look, we can't go on like this. Let's come to agreement. They signed a treaty called the Westphalian Treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And that treaty essentially said what goes on inside the sovereign borders of a nation state is their business, unless it spills out and somehow affects or threatens others around, the neighbors around them. But as long as it remains within the boundaries of the nation state, that's their business. And that was the system that we came to know. I mean, it prevailed from the 1600s all the way through the 20th century and until now in the 21st, when I would argue that it is coming undone. It is coming unglued in a number of ways, and part of the reason for that is the migration of these kinds of capabilities that threaten critical infrastructure across the boundaries of all these countries, across the boundaries of the world, in the hands of transnational, subnational, and sometimes national actors with animosity towards this Western system. Let's talk about one of those particular threats. It comes from the forces of Islamic Jihad and Sharia. Those may be defined as forces that seek to impose by force or guile, or both, the system of Islamic law known as Sharia. It is obligatory under Islamic law for all Muslims for all time. Doesn't mean they all obey that. Most people would agree that many faith congregations do not always obey the dictates of their faith. In this case, lucky for us, they don't. But it is an obligation. Jihad is an obligation doctrinally for all Muslims. So that is a threat coming against the Western civilization. Why? Because the objective of the forces of Jihad and Sharia is to erase those sovereign borders that we just talked about under the Westphalian system. To erase those borders, as you see happening, for instance, over in the Middle East right now, with the former Iraq and what used to be called Syria. Those boundaries are gone. Those boundaries were drawn by British, primarily, and French colonial powers after World War I in the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916. Those borders are gone, and the purpose of erasing those borders by the forces that we're talking about here was to create what? A caliphate. What is a caliphate? It is a global, or at least an international Islamic government, under which there are no individual borders, but all is within the same big border of the caliphate or the Islamic government. So that is that threat. We asked this question a lot after 9/11 down in the United States where I'm from. Why do they hate us? And if you were listening to what I just said about the objective to establish an international caliphate without individual borders, you'll see that the existence of sovereign, independent states, which are governed by rule of law, which are governed by consent of the governed, with primacy of individual liberty, the kinds of things that Canada and the United States hold dear and the citizens of our countries hold dear, the very existence of that kind of system or those kinds of states would be an impediment, right, to the establishment of a caliphate, and therefore becomes the enemy of the establishment of the caliphate. So the jihad offensive is global, organized. It includes nation states and subnational or now transnational groups like the Islamic State. And the enemy is anywhere that independent nation states exist under rule of man-made law, because the caliphate, of course, would be ruled by what? Ruled by law believed to come from Allah. Now, the Islamic State has had a tremendous amount of success over in the Middle East. The reason that it has had so much success is because it fulfills the hopes and the dreams, literally, of hundreds of millions of Muslims the world over. The Muslim world has been without, or had been without, a caliphate since 1924 in the wake of World War I, when the Turkish Ottoman Empire collapsed, and out of it, Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and also the new rump state, I guess you would call it, of Turkey was led by Kemal Ataturk, who abolished the last Islamic caliphate in 1924. Indeed, the actual rise of the Muslim Brotherhood 4 years later in 1928 was a direct answer and a result of the abolishment of the caliphate, because what does the Brotherhood stand for? Two things: reestablish the caliphate under Sharia. So the Islamic State has sort of jumped the gun and gone ahead and established a caliphate for the first time in almost 100 years. And that is why it is such a dream for Muslims around the world to come, to make hijrah. Hijrah means migration from one place to go to another place. Tens of thousands of faithful, devout Muslims have made the hijrah from wherever they live, including our countries. Hundreds from Canada, hundreds from the United States, thousands from Europe, and many other places around the world have answered the call to hijrah to go and work with or fight with the Islamic State. Look at the illustration up in the upper right-hand corner. That's the cover page of one of Islamic State's magazines. You might know that they put out a monthly, not exactly monthly, but let's say regular issue of a magazine called Dabik. Dabik is the name of a town in northern Syria where they think the end times battles, the battles of Armageddon, are going to take place. And this particular issue was number 3. I think they're up to about 8 or 9 by now, maybe more. But this was issue 3, and it says a call to hijra. What are they saying? They're saying, you Muslims who are devout and believe in the caliphate and everything it stands for, come to the battlefields and fight with us. But it's not just fighters. Who else is being attracted? And here again we go back to the matrix of this, cross-fertilization of all kinds of fields, and you've got the best and the brightest of all, from people all over the world, in every professional field you can think of, including accountants and lawyers and doctors, and yes, cyber warfare experts and computer experts, flocking to join and help the Islamic State. Why? Because they want to be part of something historical. They want to give meaning to their life and be part of the reestablishment of the caliphate. We have to think like they think to understand. This isn't how we think, I would expect, but it is how they think, and we must understand that if we're going to formulate effective policy to defeat them. So again, the virtually unlimited funding that the Islamic State enjoys from all kinds of income, oil income, extortion income, robbing of banks income, contraband income, trafficking in antiquities, on, and yes, migrants. The Islamic State is deeply involved in the migrant trade movement up into Europe. So with all of that funding, they are able to produce very slick, sophisticated online videos, graphics, which they use for indoctrination purposes, propaganda, recruitment, training, online even, fi sabilillah, in the way of Allah, for jihad. So it wasn't just their own ability to raise money and become powerful, but that they have support, again, back to the matrix, from so many different actors. Nation states support the Islamic State. Saudi Arabia, or at least people within Saudi Arabia. Other funders from among the Gulf states like Qatar and like the UAE fund the Islamic State. Back in 2012, unfortunately, the United States helped to run guns out of Libya over to Syria, and some of those armaments fell into the hands of jihadis who would go on to become members of the Islamic State. So they had a lot of support from nation states. There are also transnational groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, like the OIC, which also, in their way of indoctrinizing or legitimizing the Islamic Jihad, help to nurture the support for future IS recruits. Other jihadi groups support the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda in the area is called Jabhat al-Nusra. Other groups also work with, sometimes on an ad hoc basis, the Islamic State. And again, some of their sources of income. So again, you see that, the interconnectivity of different elements which are helping to raise money and to fund that Islamic State. Let's look at the Iran case study in particular, partly because they pose as a regime, as a jihadist regime. I didn't make that up, by the way. That is a direct quote out of their own constitution. The Iranian constitution basically says directly that it is an Islamic jihadist regime, and you can find their constitution online in English. But I'll use them as a case study, partly because of their capabilities directly, as Dr. Pry talked about, to threaten our critical infrastructure, in particular our electric grid through the use of a nuclear EMP, but in other ways as well, including their support for terrorism, their drive to acquire other kinds of WMD, including a very sophisticated biological warfare and chemical warfare capability, their aggression in the region, certainly their Jew hatred, which of course derives from Islamic doctrine, and their world without America. That's a quote, and I put it in quotes because every single year the Iranian regime holds a conference that they call a world without America. And then they show videos of some of the capabilities, which you may have seen, for instance, online in the last couple of days. The Iranian official media posted online a video of an underground tunnel full of Shahab missiles, which are nuclear capable. They have nose cones capable of carrying nuclear payloads. And they're openly demonstrating this, showing it on the Iranian news network online yesterday and the day before. It's so in your face, America and the West, that you wonder what in the world we're doing talking to these people in the first place. The question, are they rational? If you might know a little bit about the regime in Iran, the top leadership believes in Shiite Islam. They believe in a narrative about the return of their messianic figure they call the Mahdi, and they identify that Mahdi figure as the 12th Imam. 12th Imam meaning 12th in the line down from the succession after Muhammad. There were 12 Imams that followed, father, son, and they believe that the 12th one will come back as their messianic figure at the end of times to usher in the day of judgment. Well, that's great, except that they believe that they can hasten the return of the Mahdi, of the 12th Imam, by instigating so much chaos, warfare, and strife on earth that he'll feel compelled to come back and hurry up and come set things straight. Now think about that in terms of a regime that is driving for a deliverable nuclear weapons, perhaps EMP-capable ability to threaten Western civilization, Western critical infrastructure across the world. Question, are they rational? In our terms, in our paradigm, maybe not. In theirs, maybe so. Threat convergence, the title of this presentation, basically. Look at the different actors with which Iran works. Anything from Al-Qaeda to Anonymous, Hamas, Hezbollah, KGB, yes, I still call them the KGB, the Russian intelligence services, North Koreans, narco-traffickers. We're back to the matrix, in other words. And what do they work together on? All those things at the bottom. Some of those directly threaten our critical infrastructure in very many ways in the West, in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere across the West. Let me talk about some of the cyber armies that face us, including those of Iran and Russia, as well as the Islamic State, by the way, also has its own cyber army. And these cyber armies include very sophisticated, university-educated, very clever people working to bring down our critical infrastructure through cyber attack. Iran openly boasts about this capability. Russia flaunts it. So does China, flaunts its cyber capability against us, attacking everything from government organizations and agencies to NGOs to academic institutions and to private companies. And it's not just to steal stuff like steal industrial secrets, which you might think might be the primary purpose, and it's part of it, but it's also to actually cripple and to bring down our critical infrastructure. That is the more important, I would say, objective of these cyber armies, not just to steal secrets, how to make a better widget, but rather to bring down our civilization through cyber attack of our critical infrastructure elements, meaning electricity, gas, water, transportation, banking, finance, etc. So all of these players at the national level, and as I'm saying here also, the subnational Al-Qaeda, Islamic State level, field cyber armies, and you see some of their emblems or flags around there. China, let's look at China quickly here. This year, just very recently, it became public that a white paper produced by the Chinese military openly talks about, officially acknowledges that China is committed to building a cyber force with the capability to engage in offensive cyber operations against us, Western countries, Canada, the US, Western Europe, but they've openly now allowed this military doctrine to be published, and we can see that on the internet. Our Department of State in the United States and Department of Defense have openly expressed their serious concern about China's cyber abilities as well as aggressive intent. Let's look at Iran quickly and its cyber capabilities. What you're looking here at here is the cover of a report called Operation Cleaver, and it was produced by a private U.S. company called Cylance last year, late November 2014, and they published this online, and you can find it online if you just go Google Cylance or Operation Cleaver, and it's a report about the capabilities of the Iranian cyber army or cyber force in Iran. And what they found is that Iran already has the capability to enter into our supposedly protected critical infrastructure systems, the control systems of those critical infrastructure systems, meaning, again, electric, oil, water, gas, transportation, banking, finance, and on and on. And they found that Iran already has a presence, an active presence, is already inside our systems of 16 countries, not just the United States, but also Australia, Canada, Israel, and several others. And that we don't know how to stop them. We don't know how to get them out. We don't know how to stop them. We don't know how to block them. Think about that. Russian cyber capability. You heard Dr. Pry mention about the Russian invasion of Georgia, the country of Georgia, back in 2008. It was preceded by a massive cyber attack that took down the Georgian electric capability. They modified then, after that attack, after that invasion, the Kremlin modified the very software that they use, the malware, in order to infiltrate and commandeer industrial control systems in the United States. Elements, again, of our critical infrastructure. It was found out eventually, you can see the dates here, by which it operated from 2011 to 2014, about 3 years, and then it was detected and stopped. But in that period of time, they gained access, the Kremlin, the KGB, Putin, gained access to systems that control United States power grids, water distribution systems, nuclear power plants. This is serious. These are serious capabilities arrayed against our critical infrastructure elements. These, of course, by nation states, but others are including cooperation and coordination with non-nation state entities. Let me talk about Iran coming closer to the United States in a very physical way. Iran has established, and the threat that poses by their physical proximity, getting closer and closer to the United States and to Canada here in the Western Hemisphere. They've got a firm foothold. It began down in South America. It has moved north through Central America, piggybacking off of diplomatic ties with some of the countries, and also working back to the matrix, working with terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, working with narcotics cartels like out of Colombia and Mexico, and also with gangs that move narcotics, among other things, like the Maras of Central America. By the way, Iran is building drones in Venezuela right now. Those drones do not have a huge long range yet, the ones that they're building as far as we know, but what if they move them straight up to the border of Mexico with the United States? That would certainly threaten the United States a lot more directly. And if they got them any further, who knows how far they would go or extended their range. The other thing that the Iranians are doing is making arrangements and agreements with different, especially Caribbean island countries, to use their documentation, meaning passports, visas, travel documents, citizenship papers, and they're buying these documents. In other words, in order to paper Iranian or Hezbollah operatives to work through the Western Hemisphere with access to our countries, but now they're carrying the passport of, let's say, St. Kitts and Nevis, or one of the other island countries, Antigua, say, of the Caribbean, which looks a lot less threatening, doesn't it, than an Iranian passport. So that's what they're doing. Let's talk about Hezbollah very quickly, because wherever there is Iran, there is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the wholly owned terror proxy of the Iranian regime. In fact, Hezbollah's Secretary General and other leaders, Hassan Nasrallah, have openly pledged bayat. Bayat means loyalty, allegiance, to the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That means that the chain of command for Hezbollah goes directly to Iran, goes through the Quds Force, which is a subsidiary division of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and to the commander-in-chief. By the way, in the Iranian system, their president is not the commander-in-chief. As in America, our president is the commander-in-chief. No, in their system, the supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of all their military, including the IRGC, Quds Force, and of course now Hezbollah. Hezbollah works together with all kinds of criminal and narco-trafficking organizations the world over, but certainly in the Western Hemisphere. Unfortunately, they are coming across our southern border with Mexico, which is very poorly defended at the moment. This is a warning you see from one of our former top officials, Drug Enforcement Agency, Michael Braun, talking about the Iranian Quds Force Command of Hezbollah and their criminal operations throughout the Americas. I would say Americas plural, North, Central, and South. The Buenos Aires bombings of 1992 and 1994 were perpetrated by Hezbollah under command and control orders of the Iranian regime. Hezbollah operated out of what is called the tri-border area of South America. It's a place where Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay come together with their borders. And it's kind of a lawless area that none of them really police. And so that is where Hezbollah launched the attacks from, but it was guided and directed by the Tehran regime, and specifically out of the Iranian regime embassy in Buenos Aires. Moving north, Hezbollah is very present in Mexico and works very closely with the Mexican drug cartels. Now think about the capabilities. Hezbollah is a super sophisticated organization. These are university-educated, professional people with degrees in things like computer science and cyber capabilities, as well as multilingual, as well as they are engineers and medical doctors. That's what Hezbollah is. And it is a tool of the Iranian regime. They are coming across our southern border right now, have established cells inside of the United States and, yes, inside of Canada as well. They are waiting for orders because they will not do anything on a rogue basis. They're not just going to go off on their own and commit some attack. They will wait for the orders from the supreme leader, from Tehran, from the Ayatollah Khamenei, to do something. But when that order comes, they will salute and obey. And they are present and establishing that network of cells inside of our countries right now in preparation for if ever when such an order may come. In the meantime, in order to support themselves and to be ready, they are engaged in all kinds of criminal activity, from fraud to cigarette smuggling to car theft rings, you name it, contraband of all sorts. As well as conducting things like pre-attack casing and surveillance on American targets, I would expect Canadian ones too, and also Israeli targets, meaning Israeli embassies and consulates throughout the United States, and also the homes and the individuals, the diplomats who staff those diplomatic facilities for Israel. That's what Hezbollah is doing in our country. And there is evidence that there is some of that, at least, going on inside of Canada as well. Collaboration, again, we're back to the matrix. They collaborate together. Hezbollah, Quds Force, the nation of Iran, as well as criminal elements. The links with the Mexican drug cartels have a purpose, and it is not necessarily to compete head-to-head for market share, let's say, with narcotics or amphetamines, which they're also dealing in. But rather it is to piggyback off of the cartel's already existing channels of transport. Once you've got a channel, and a channel is nothing more than this federale, that border guard, this tunnel, that's a channel. And they use them to move what Hezbollah wants to move, which could be drugs, maybe money, also terrorists, other terrorists, not just Hezbollah. So they're working together, and what do the cartels get out of this? They get expertise from Hezbollah in things like, I think I've got that on the next, the expertise in things like explosives, like weapons, and probably tunneling as well. So here are just some figures from the United States in terms of people coming across our southern border, the latest 2013-2014 figures that are out there. You can see we've got a very long southern border. It's not quite as long as our northern one with Canada, but our southern border is unfortunately poorly protected at this moment, and so there are a lot of people coming across. We don't even know who or how many exactly. Tunnels, I was talking about tunnels. This is one of the expertises that Hezbollah has to offer to the Mexican drug cartels, as well as to a variety of other terrorist organizations. Now, I was just in Israel again this past December, and the IDF took us down into one of the tunnels that Hamas had built from Gaza across into a kibbutz on the Israeli side of the border. And it looked pretty much just like this. You know all that wonderful funding that the Europeans are providing so that the poor Palestinians in Gaza can buy cement and build houses? Unfortunately, they're not building houses with the cement, they're building tunnels. They're completely lined in cement, as you can see in this example. This happens to be a tunnel across the U.S.-Mexican border, but the one I was in on the Israeli kibbutz, they intended to pop up, by the way, out of that and other tunnels on Rosh Hashanah last September, and murder as many Jews as they possibly could while they were in their synagogues celebrating the high holy days. That was the plan. It was foiled, luckily, before it could be carried out. But the tunnel looks like this, completely lined, heavily lined in concrete, and with electric, you can see the electric line there to provide lighting and to provide ventilation. Some of these tunnels are very long, a kilometer and a half long even. Look just like the ones that you see here across our southern border. This is what the cartels are using. It's what Hezbollah is using. It's what other terrorist organizations are using to come across our southern border right now. Some of the cartels, in fact, Mexican cartels, are actually specializing, for a fee, of course, in transport of certain terrorist groups. So one cartel will do just Al-Qaeda and bring them across. Another will do just Al-Shabaab, and that's who they specialize in. Somebody else smuggles only Hezbollah and brings them in. This is what I'm talking about, the matrix, the cross-fertilization. And these guys, again, back to our key point here, Hezbollah is absolutely as capable as Iran in the ability to threaten our critical infrastructure. They're also very expert in classical clandestine intelligence, which they learned from the IRGC, which in turn learned from the Soviets. Tradecraft is world class. When I talk about tradecraft, I'm talking about things like infiltrating our law enforcement, not just to find out if their name's on a list or they're being watched, but also to suborn and subvert, to buy law enforcement, which will then, maybe turn the other way when they're coming across the border. That sort of thing is what they're doing. All right, I'm going to leave it there at the moment because there's an awful lot more we could talk about, but I know that you have questions and we have more presentations to go. But again, the takeaway from this that I'd like you to remember is that there are many threats that are capable of threatening our critical infrastructures in our countries, yours and mine, and that these groups are national, they are transnational, subnational, criminal, and they work together. Thank you very much.